Jeffrey Martin, welcome to the Worldhappiness Week by the Worldhappiness Fest. It's always a pleasure. Since I started this, you've been always here and always top of mind and always bringing the actually wisdom. You open, you close, you've been all over. So that's why, I mean, you're my hero. You're so much my hero that I did the finance course, and I at some point I felt non-duality at some point. So it's I feel good, by the way, now all the time. So thank you so much, Jeffrey. It's amazing having you.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks so much for that. And it's an honor to be here every time you do one of these. I am a huge fan. It's unbelievable what you have put together over these few short years. It's just so incredible. So I'm just so grateful. Anything I can do to help out, I'm totally down with it.
Yeah, I know that. And we are building this community together with TransTech and so on. So as you know, the week is going amazing, and we are exploring suffering from so many different angles. So you know about suffering, and you know about fundamental well-being. So how can we relate suffering and fundamental well-being?
Absolutely. I think fundamental well-being is best thought of as the escape from the human condition of the type of suffering that is so dominant for the average person, which is usually around the mind and all of their negative thoughts and thinking. But what people don't realize is that sits on top of just their basic survival instinct. Every animal has this instinct to survive first and foremost. And humans are absolutely no different than that, even though we don't like to think of ourselves as animals, like we're above the animals, right? And all of that. But of course we're not. We're animals just like everybody else. We've evolved the same way. And so we've got this sense within us in every moment that really wants to survive, and that bubbles up to a sense that something in this moment might not be right. I don't know what it is, but I've got to be on guard. My nervous system, it's got to be on guard. Something might be wrong. Something might be about to get me. Now, the reality, of course, is we're living incredibly safe lives, most of us, right? And so, in fact, most of our governments and societies are conspiring to keep us alive, right? It's hard to get bad food. It's hard to starve to death these days. Our worlds are relatively safe by comparison. And so this is old wiring, old animal wiring, and it turns out to be old animal wiring that we don't really need anymore. You can have your brain rewire into what we call fundamental well-being, which has really been discovered, millennia ago by people that called it things like enlightenment, non-duality, persistent mystical experience, God consciousness, unity consciousness, all that type of stuff. But it doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be spiritual. It's just a rewiring that can happen in the brain. Man, when that happens, you get that sense of discontentment that is the core of human suffering, that everybody thinks is that hole that you can never fill. You get that solved, and you basically are in a state where everything is fine. And there's a lot of peace and contentment and wholeness and, a lot of goodness that people have heard about that comes from that. And so that's what we've worked on for the last 15 years. And, I feel like we've pretty well licked it at this point. We have protocols that have a pretty high rate of helping people and stuff like that. So I think of suffering from that standpoint and as it being pretty optional. Now that's different than if you're in like terrible nerve pain or something. Obviously that's a different type of suffering, but the suffering that goes across all of humanity, I think is that, and I think it's curable.
I love it. Actually, this morning I was in a session focused on courage, awareness, and love. And just in a couple of minutes, 3 people, it was a breakout, were crying, completely crying. Wow. So now that you say suffering is optional, and people start crying in a couple of minutes because there's so much pressure, how do we balance this? I mean, how do we help? Because I feel a lot of pressure right now in so many places. Do you have any ideas how to scale this?
Yeah, I think it's actually very simple. That's the interesting thing. In fact, sometimes I think our work is so simple in terms of what we found that people just move on. They look at it and they think it can't possibly be that simple. This core problem of the human condition, like, how can it be that simple? And they're like, that can't work. And so they just sort of discount it and move on, which I think is too bad, because it really is very simple. It's simple because we've inherited millennia of people working on this problem, right? And I think there have been periods over the years, like even, for instance, we did some research with some nuns in Myanmar that were like 90-year-old nuns. And when they were 20-year-old nuns or 18-year-old nuns or whatever, their methods in Myanmar, their Buddhist methods, their Theravada noting practice of meditation was working like a champ. I mean, basically people would come there, they would transition right away. If it was a second week that somebody was going into, they were like, oh, we better give them a little more time. They're just a little slower than the other people. But I mean, it was that reliable, right? So I think there have been periods in human history where these methods have been very, very reliable and they've been passed down to us. And all we've done is basically said, listen, there's a simple formula to this, right? The formula is first, you have to sort of distill what the best methods are to even begin trying. Second, you have to find the method that's right for you, and then just practice that method. And, you can know if a method is right for you. Any method, any meditation method, any method, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's like a cognitive science type method, like more like Headless Way that people can look up and they can Google that and it's totally free and available, or whether it's something like a mantra meditation or the Theravada noting that was going on in that monastery in Myanmar or wherever. Basically it's you basically just have to look through a bunch of methods, unless you get lucky, to find the one that is for you. How you do that is really simple. It's just a week of 1 hour practice of that method, and that's it. At the end of that week, if that method isn't clicking, if your life isn't noticeably better, if your reactivity isn't notably reduced or whatever, then chuck that method and get a new, go on to the next one and try the next one for a week. And if the same thing happens, then chuck that one, go to the next method, try the next one for a week. So all our protocols is basically, we've collected together the best things out there. We've massaged them a little bit based on our understanding of neuroscience and stuff. And then, we just have people go through and systematically try them until they find the one that works for them. And, our latest protocol is like 6 weeks with a 65% success rate, right? If it's 12 weeks, it's like 80% success rate at this point. And so, it's literally just a trial and error type thing. And then third, if a method stops working for you, give it a couple of weeks. If it doesn't kick back in, then that method is done for you. It's done what it's going to do for you, and you begin the search process over again until you find one that does. We don't care what happens during meditation. You can have profound meditations that do nothing for you in terms of your actual life. So that's not what we're looking for. You're looking for actual impact on your life. Are you less reactive? Are you happier as you go throughout your day? Those types of things. And when you find a method that's producing that, you just want to keep doing it. And we find that it doesn't take very long. Really, it can only, it can only take a week for you to transition to this. It can take 2 weeks for you to transition to this. Just like the nuns back in Myanmar, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, whatever, when they had a method that was well matched to the consciousness and to the brains and to the nervous system of their population at that time. In a week, they were, basically transitioning most people. It was just the slow ones that took a second week, right? So you don't have to be a slow one. You can find the method, have it work for you that week, and be done with this and be moving on with your life from this amazing new perspective.
I love it. I love it. And you know what I love the most, because I tried many of those methods through the Finder's course for months. So I think it was about 26 plus positive psychology and so on. What is amazing is the way you brought thousands into a bunch of 26, but each of them is giving you so much power. Something that I feel that every time I even think about it, I feel great, is actually contemplation. Is contemplation and poetry.
Oh, nice.
So this is something that I'm building for myself as well. But when For example, you do headless. I mean, maybe you can explain a bit what is the movement, because actually my second question is around what is the state of the art. I mean, what is something that is really going to change the perception from many people? But we can link the state of the art in the science of or experimentation of spirituality with a few techniques. Maybe that could be great. But actually, the one that one of the ones that, I mean, it's so great for me, is just basically the art of contemplation and poetry, with combined with meditation. So that's beautiful. But can you tell us a bit more? I mean, what's going on and what is really working for you?
Absolutely. And as you know, that's in many ways the heart of something like a Christian mysticism, right? Is that sort of contemplation. In their case, their poetry is either a mystical text written by mystics that came before them, or the Bible, or whatever else, right? So that is a tried and true method. You see it also in Islam and the Sufi faith. And so that's very, the Abrahamic traditions are very much aligned with that. That's very powerful. So for so many people, it's a great example of what is a gold standard method that's really risen to the top of humanity for millennia, right? So from a state of the art standpoint, there's so much going on, it's so awesome. It's such an exciting space to work in. One of the things that we've been excited about in recent years has been the ability to directly just stimulate any part of the brain. So one of the cool things that we've been working on is something called transcranial ultrasound, which is exactly what you think it is. It's like when your wife is pregnant, or you're pregnant, or whoever, and they put the ultrasound on and it sees through the body and you can see the baby in there. They also use it for stroke patients on the brain to see if they're stopping the bleeding and stuff like that. But it can be used in a very precise way now to really target any part of the brain. And so we did this stuff years and years and years ago, probably 2010 or so, 2009, 2010, where we did some neuroscience collaborations to really try to figure out what was going on with fundamental well-being in the brain. And that gave us the areas to look at. And now we can directly stimulate that. Now, I think it's going to be another 5-10 years, maybe more, before people can, buy a device that's been vetted through the government and, all of that in the West and put it on their head. But that's coming. That's coming. And you're going to basically be able to just push a button and experience this type of state. And I tell you what, you're going to be able to push a button and experience all kinds of other states. And so out of body states, I guarantee you that there's going to be a button push for that. Probably more psychedelic type states, there's probably going to be a button for that. And so we're in for a real revolution from a technology standpoint in terms of just literally directly and non-invasively. Don't have to drill any holes or anything like that. It's just sort of a big old speaker that goes on the outside of your head and puts a very low amount of energy in there. So I think that's a really exciting thing. Another thing that I think is really exciting that's finally, I think, starting to come to the forefront. One of the things that is the case in the spiritual community is that the spiritual community in the West, I don't find this in our research in the East so much, but in our research in the West, I find that the spiritual community has been very much, kind of guilted into things, like guilted into, there are parts of it that are like no sex, or, you've got to have vegan food, or, this, that, or the other thing, right? You've got to, you shouldn't have any money. You should give all your money away, or you shouldn't make any money off of spirituality, or these types of consciousness states or whatever else, which is a pretty great way to guarantee that they don't grow. I mean, of course, like every religion has mechanisms where they get tons of money in, right? And so that's so you have sort of, I think, these false beliefs. I think of them as myths because they're all myths. I mean, at this point, we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of research subjects. You're talking about thousands of people really who have transitioned off of our work at this point. And, I like to think they had great sex lives and enjoyed their steak and, whatever else, right? Like they had a great quality of life while they were going through this. And so I think one of the things that's going on is a transformation on the leading edge of spirituality in the direction of it's okay to think about and to have an awesome quality of life as a modern human. You don't have to, you don't have to live by these old monkish ideals that may not even really be monkish ideals when you actually go to the East and stuff that have been sort of absorbed over here. And I'll tell you what I think is chasing that right on the tail of that, which I think is going to be super exciting and is a bleeding edge thing. And that is what has been popularly called things like the law of attraction and synchronicity and things like that. And it's this notion that somehow there's an interface between us and reality. I think it's really undeniable at this point that a lot of that there's enough science that's been generated between, Russ Targ and those guys and Hal Puthoff and the SRI experiments, the Stanford Research Institute's experiments, talking about 20 years of experiments with, tons of money from the US government and secret projects and stuff that now aren't secret so much anymore, to, Bob John and Brenda Dunn and, one of the world's great material science chair of the material science department at Princeton, that looked into this. I mean, you're talking about hardcore, very rigorous, first tier scientists that have explored this area and produced what I think is really incontrovertible evidence that there is something that is going on between consciousness and matter, no matter where you fall on that, whether you fall on it's all consciousness and matter is springing from it. So of course we can affect it that way, or whether they're separate and there's some sort of interaction. I don't care what your view of it is. But that really, I think, is a comer on the bleeding edge that is moving more and more and more into first the mainstream of sort of the spiritual and self-help kind of space. And I'll tell you one thing that's fascinating about that research, and that is that the people that are in a non-dual or what we would call a fundamental well-being place of consciousness, those people are statistically way better usually at producing those types of effects than ordinary people, right? And so that is really on the bleeding edge. And you saw that, you saw that with people at all of these different labs and all of these different institutions, whether it's the big ones that I've mentioned and some of the other big ones, or whether it's, some smaller experimental labs like Dean Radin at IONS or whoever else. And so I think this is a surprising thing that's really going to increasingly enter our mainstream of spirituality, our mainstream of self-help. And especially if you combine that with, hey, it's okay to have a great life, while we're here, while we're experiencing material reality, like why not have it be an awesome life? That's going to play into that. And I think what that's going to make possible as the science continues to advance on that and it gets more reliable for people to be able to produce just really a synchronistic and amazing life, that's just all going to come together. So I think those are two really exciting things on the bleeding edge right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. This is amazing. Can I ask you a bit more about something that we talked about this before? Is the life between lives? Because the more I explore and the more you believe somehow that there might life between lives, and actually that could be our real life as souls. When you change the perspective, anything changes. Because when you change the perspective, it's like, okay, we are now in these bodies. Let's explore, let's experiment, let's have fun. Let's do everything in order to evolve and expand, right? But what about, have you done any research or anything going on that builds on Michael Newton's or basically any trend that you see that is actually exploring that life between life as the life itself? For ourselves?
Only here and there. I would run across it in our research subjects, some of whom claim to remember stuff like that. And then, of course, I will occasionally be speaking at the same thing as The UVA guys, University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies or something like that. I can't remember quite what their thing is called. Something unusual like that, who study the reincarnation folks, especially, and they've discovered these patterns of reincarnations and reincarnation memories around young people. And there's life between life memories that are associated with that. There are some other researchers that sort of specialize in this type of stuff. I think it's a nascent area, and it's so hard to think about. Imagine if you're like Jim Tucker at UVA, right? And somebody comes to you and they say, "Hi, I remember when I was in my last life, I was shot in a neighboring village, and I've got this birthmark, and it's right where the shotgun blast would have been, right? And you can go to the neighboring village, and people are like, oh yeah, we remember that, and whatever else. And there's like really, it's improbable that the person would have the birthmark, would have the memory of it and all of, but you can verify it, right? It's going to be a while. If there is a life between life, I think it's going to be a while before science can sort of reach up into that life between life space and do that same level of verification. And I think that is the tricky part around all this. I'll tell you, Peter Fenwick really, every time, I love Peter. I don't know if you're familiar with his work or not, but he's a world-class neurophysiologist and neuropsychologist in the UK, a fellow of the Royal Academy and all that stuff. And he's fascinated by the moment of death and what happens around the moment of death. And he really believes that people go into sort of a non-dual state of consciousness right at the moment of death or just before the moment of death. And that there's all these pieces that go around this notion of this life between lives. And one of them is that type of transcendence happening before that, right? And so I think there's a lot of people piecing together sort of the evidentiary stuff that can be done on our side of this. And it's super interesting work.
Okay, well, so we have to keep exploring. We have a couple of minutes. Final question. We always talk about scaling up, about fundamental well-being. I call it myself fundamental peace, which is pretty similar. It's about freedom, consciousness, and happiness combined somehow. Do you think we are closer? Because as you know, I mean, every year is is another year in order to get into an opportunity for more people to feel less suffering. Are we closer? Yeah. Is COVID stopping us? Is accelerating fundamental well-being? What's your perception?
It's a good question. From a societal level, there's always this hope that there's just some force of humanity that's pushing us more in this direction. But I don't think that's actually the case. I think that, most of the mechanisms of media, for instance, which are really what shapes our culture, are moving us, continuing to move us in the opposite direction. And in fact, that was the main thing that those nuns in Myanmar noticed over their 80 years or whatever of being nuns, was that, they noticed Myanmar is a little bit behind the rest of the world, right, with the adoption of media technology. And so they could remember, like, when radio came in and when TV came in and when movies came in and when all these different things came in and became more popular, the internet, obviously, and things like that. And they said, every time one of those moved in, it's like the consciousness of the people that were coming to our ashrams and our meditation centers and stuff were just a little bit further away and harder to reach and harder to impact with our methods than before. And now we've had so many of these pile up that now when people come to us, we're lucky to have somebody transition in 3 months, much less the 1 week that was so common when we started off and we were young nuns. And so I think actually humanity, sadly, is sort of moving further and further away from this. And it's largely a result of media, which, as you know, I was in for a very long time earlier in my life, and television and advertising industry and all kinds of things like that. And so, I'm as guilty for having created culture for really billions of people in some instances with some of the things that I did as anyone else. And on the other side, though, right, is, I think, an evolutionary pressure that's coming. Now, you and I may not see it in our lifetimes, right? But, you know, grandkids very well may. And that is, there's an evolutionary pressure that I think is I talk about this a lot with, you know, I spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley and stuff like that. It's where one of our main labs are and stuff like that. And so, you know, I wind up talking to the people that are more or less at the top of that place. And they see a coming moment, which is all around, you know, robots and artificial intelligence and more or less humans not having a whole heck of a lot to do. And they spend a lot of time out there trying to think about, what does an AI economy look like? And, you know, stuff like that, right? Because we really have no idea if humans will really even have value at a certain point in an AI-driven economic system like this and whatnot, right? And so I think that one of the things that is being experimented with is, from an evolutionary pressure standpoint, is fundamental well-being, because it's not going to happen this decade or next decade or the decade after that, but somewhere between 50 and 100 years from now, you're going to have a situation where humans are going to need to be in a very different state of consciousness, a consciousness where they can just sort of be fine without an identity of work, or without a lot of these other types of identities and types of things that we strive for, and, you know, differentiation factors in our culture and stuff like that. And I suspect personally that fundamental well-being is one of those things that is being experimented with by nature as being a potential solution for this. I think it's clearly experimenting with some other solutions, and maybe one of its solutions will be a lot less people, you know, who knows? But I suspect that, you know, one of the reasons we are seeing a bit of an upswell, right, in fundamental well-being since about 1996 on, I think a lot of that relates to the internet and the ability to share information. And as you're, you know, if you were stuck in a Christian part of the world where you had like 3 methods of Christianity to try to get you to fundamental well-being, and none of those were a fit for you, you were more or less screwed, you know, 100 years ago or something, right? But since 1996, and you've got all this internet connectivity and all this really sort of an inflection point for the exchange of information and stuff like that. And now we have a lot more knowledge of these methods. You know, you can do a project like ours. Our project wouldn't have been possible 30 years ago. You know, it just came about right at the right moment in history, really, to be able to put together those methods that you're talking about and make them work and whatnot. And so there is an upswing. It's getting crushed, you know, by the other side. But there is an upswing. And I think that upswing is most likely, if you think about it, to be an experiment of nature to see what this does in a larger percentage of humans. And if this winds up being a solution for 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years, you know, down the road, as we see this march of technology. Because unless there's some solar flare that wipes out our technology, you know, it's going in the direction of robotics and AI and humans sitting around not doing a whole lot. And so we're going to need a very different type of consciousness than the one that we have right now. And the one that I'm in can do that all day long, not care at all, right? It's perfectly happy to just sit and stare at a river, and, you know, which is out the back window of my house right now, and just look at beautiful nature, you know, and all of that, right? And so that's my 2 cents on that, for whatever it's worth. Who knows?
Well, I think is very much worth, and I really appreciate sharing all this window, this wisdom with everybody. And well, let's keep on the journey, exploring and advancing the science and the experimentation. And I recommend everybody to go into your new course, which is now, I mean, from a week to 6 weeks, but it's fantastic. And I will be sending links as well to everybody so they can experiment. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It's always so awesome to get a chance to talk to you. We are 2 super busy people with all the stuff that we're doing, right? So we rarely get a chance to chat, but I don't know about you. I love it when we get a chance. I'm so grateful for it.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.
always so relaxed. There is no time to waste. I am so relaxed. It puts a smile upon my face. So relaxed. I am so relaxed.
Dancing, I don't see the people living with them trouble, y'all. Dancing, I don't see the people living with them trouble, y'all. Whoa, 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 hey.
Cherish life today, cherish life today, only one way. The fight against coronavirus is putting us to the test. All it takes is a simple choice that makes the difference between life and death. Let's do our best to stay healthy every day, so we can help each other keep sickness away. Yeah, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. Oh, there's one way we know. Do it with our neighbors round the world. It's one way, one way, one world, one world. Social distancing we say to keep the virus at bay. It's one way, one way, one world, one world. Keep your hands clean. It involves you and me. Tell it go away. We are one way. 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 One way. Well, we might be apart, we're connected. Even if for now it's good we stay isolated. The more we join in and share this challenge together, there's no storm that we can't weather. Let's do our best to stay healthy every day, so we can help each other keep sickness away. Yeah, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. Oh, there's one way we know. Do it with our neighbors round the world. It's one way, one way, one world, one world. Social distancing we say to keep the virus at bay. It's one way, one way, one world, one world. Keep your hands clean. It involves you and me. Tell it go away. We are one way. 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 Oh, cherish our life. Bye.